COVID-19 was the best thing to happen to the UFC. Well, you may have forgotten or not noticed, but with this past week, it was the 5th anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic starting. It might sound crazy, but we have reached half a decade since a period of time that forever altered the way the world in politics, business, relationships all worked. One of those, of course, being sports, and it is indisputable to say that the UFC has forever been changed since going through COVID. So today, I wanted to go over and look back at the UFC in 2020 and explain that besides tough, it was the greatest decision that the company ever made. To start off, heading into 2020, the UFC had some great things going for them in the past year. In 2019, they just made the move over to ESPN, the worldwide leader in sports, for their fights and pay-per-views. While this obviously is viewed as a negative nowadays, it was seen as a massive thing for the sport's legitimacy to engage with new fans at the time. They had just come off having 57,000 people in attendance at UFC 243 in Melbourne, Australia, between Whitaker and Adesanya, the most highly attended event still to this day. For stars, you had Jon Jones, Khabib, a young, marketable face in Adesanya. Jorge Masvidal was on cloud 9 after his incredible 2019, and obviously still McGregor. And speaking of the notorious, 2020 looked like it was off to a hot start as he headlined the January 246 pay-per-view and KO'd Cowboy Cerrone 40 seconds into the first round. People may not know this now, but at the time in January 2020, there was serious talk about McGregor and Masvidal fighting for the BMF belt, but that is a story for a different day. From there, you had one of the most unforgettable main events at UFC 247, where Jon Jones won in a unanimous decision defending his belt against Dominic Reyes. It was followed in UFC 248 with Israel Adesanya's first title defense against Yoel Romero that was overshadowed by possibly the greatest women's title fight of all time between champion Zhang Weili and Joanna Jędrzejczyk. And from there, we begin our story of March to December of 2020. Now, before I begin on laying out the positives, I want to immediately get out of the way the negatives that came with COVID. First, being that it was a disease and taking lives. In the UFC community, there was none bigger than that unfortunately took Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov from us. This tragic death of Abdulmanap was the reason that led to Khabib retiring immediately following his win at UFC 254. Had Abdulmanap not passed away, Khabib would have kept fighting. He would have, in all likelihood, passed the 3 title defenses, beaten Oliveira, or Tony, or whoever, possibly gone up to welterweight, and as a result, the all-time rankings in the sport would look a lot different than it does right now. Another aspect of Khabib retiring in 2020 is that it occurred with no fans in attendance. This leads to the second negative of COVID, mainly due to it dragging on to today, and it is continuation of fights in the UFC Apex. While it was seen understandable at the time to have cards with no fans and just have fighters and their teams, it has been going on for far too long. Since the UFC brought fans back in April of 2021, the number of Apex events is decreased every year. It went from 31 in 2021, 21 in 2022, 17 in 2023, only to stay at 17 in 2024. Currently, the UFC has 7 events that have either happened or are slated to be in the Apex. While it is a decreasing improvement, why are they still happening? The UFC made $1.4 billion in revenue last year. Every place they go, the arena sells out. They should have no excuses considering they were traveling to different locations for every card prior to COVID. I don't care that Mark Shapiro says that we as fans can't tell the difference between a fight in the arena or in the Apex. In 2025, no fan is excited when they hear this weekend's card is in the Apex. And connecting with that, no fans in the building. We lost out some of the all-time legends having their final fight without a resounding applause. Both Khabib and Daniel Cormier, 2 of the greatest ever, retired in venues that you could hear a pin drop. They weren't the only ones that did not get their proper send-offs. Both Anderson Silva and Anthony Pettis both fought their last times for the UFC in empty arenas before not being re-signed. All 4 of them got endings to their career that was, to use a term at the time that was uttered so often, a string of very unfortunate events. Now, it's time to go over the positives, and there are a boatload. First, and most noticeably, the viewership. Now, the numbers aren't definitive on this. However, Dana recently said back in November that the UFC fan base grew 68% during COVID. This is what people like to call the COVID bump. Now, is that 100% believable? And has Dana ever lied about a statistic like such?
Power slap. This thing's been around for 15 months. It's a $750 million business.
It's debatable. However, Dana does have some receipts. Back in August of 2022, him and the UFC released a video showcasing how they persevered through COVID while many journalists on the sidelines digressed and arguably committed character assassination. In the video, they include the following statistics. UFC Fight Island generated over 177 billion impressions. UFC Fight Island generated $1.3 billion in earned media value. UFC store sales hit record high, increasing 135% year over year. 152 million followers reached on social media, increased 62% year over year. Over 28,000 COVID tests, 0 jobs lost at the UFC, record high pay-per-view buys, average per event, UFC live event viewership up 33% year over year, and a record year for UFC on YouTube with 2.5 billion views. Yeah, that's a lot. The impressions on social media, I strongly believe, given how much people's screen usage went up during COVID. While I would initially be skeptical of the record high for pay-per-view buys, I did my research and was proven corrected. From May of 2020 to October, look at these 5 pay-per-views and their numbers. First, we have May of 2020, UFC 249, Gaethje vs. Ferguson, with 700,000 pay-per-view buys. July 2020, UFC 251 between Masvidal and Usman, 1.3 million buys. August of 2020, UFC 252, Cormier and Miocic 3, 500,000 buys. September of 2020, UFC 253, Adesanya Costa, 700,000 buys. And October 2020, UFC 254 between Khabib and Gaethje, 675,000 pay-per-view buys. That is an average of 775,000 pay-per-view buys across those 5 events. At the time going for $65 for a pay-per-view, that comes in at a little over $250 million. Furthermore, for UFC 254 and a title fight between Khabib and Gaethje, Russian media reportedly had the audience of almost 11 million. Mind you, all these numbers happened without the appearance of McGregor or Jon Jones as the main event. One last part that Dana always likes to mention whenever the topic of COVID is brought up is the no firing of his employees. With it now being 5 years since and no employee coming out to counter Dana's frequently mentioned statement, I believe it is safe to say, to put that in stone, that the UFC fired no one, and it was probably the hardest economic struggle business owners will ever experience in their lives. To go through that type of hardship does require a great captain to oversee a ship in a storm like that. Across Jacksonville, Las Vegas, and Fight Island in Abu Dhabi, Dana and the UFC persevered when it was toughest it could ever be for a sports league. For reference, Formula One wouldn't begin until July 5th. Boxing didn't return until July 7th. The NBA didn't return until July 22nd. The MLB didn't start their season until July 23rd. And the NHL did not resume until August 1st. Think about that. By the time boxing returned, the UFC had put out 8 events and 12 when the NHL returned on the 1st of August. Whether or not he did it intentionally, Dana White absorbed so many new fans that just wanted to watch sports on their TV, and the UFC was off to the races back in the prime of COVID. The second reason is the highlight moments that came with it. Every year, there are viral moments that are synonymous with the year that it happened in. For 2024, it will forever be the year of Max Holloway's KO at 300. 2022 was Leon Edwards' head kick KO of Kamaru Usman. Had the 2020 highlights ended in March, there would be many highlights that we would have missed out on. They include Yuri's debut KO of Volkan Ozdemir, Francis Ngannou's KO of Rosenstrike a minute into the first round, Sugar Sean's walk-off KO, Cody Garbrandt's KO right before the end of the round horn sounded, Izzy's title defense KO of Costa, Kevin Holland's 5-0 2020 in a 7-month span, Hamzat's one-punch KO of GM3, Khabib's submission of Justin Gaethje, and Joaquin Buckley's spinning heel KO, arguably the flashiest highlight I have ever seen still to this day in the UFC. Think about that. All these moments, all these fantastic finishes could not have happened. Moments that when they occurred, you never forgot where you were. Even people not on Earth. In 2021, Dana told one of the coolest stories about UFC fandom I have ever heard.
He's like, Dana, I have a story for you. I'm an astronaut. And during the pandemic, I was in the space station.
Right.
He said it was me and 3 Russian guys up in the space station. And we were going crazy up there. So they were beaming us the UFC fights because it was the only thing that was on.
That's sick.
And he said, you guys run Fight Island, so there were a lot of Russians on the card too.
Right.
We would get so excited for the fights, and we would watch the fights for 4 hours, and then that's all we talked about the rest of the night.
Right.
But you created this event during the pandemic where Russians and Americans could get together and be just as excited about it. And I was just like, that is the coolest UFC story that I've ever heard.
Oh, hell yeah, man.
They're watching it
Yeah.
on the space station.
Yeah.
Now that is quite an impression to make. Speaking of impressions, 2020 had a lot of guys make their debuts, and boy, were some of their first impressions a foreshadow of how good they would turn out to be. I don't think it is hyperbole to say that the class of 2020 has the potential to be the best of all time just from March onward. It includes Joaquin Buckley, Roman Dolidze, Brandon Royval, Nasruddin Imavov, Shavkat Rakhmonov, former champ Yuri Prohaska, Hamzat Chimaev, who in 2020 had the most aura any fighter I think has ever had, current middleweight champion Dricus du Plessis, current heavyweight interim champ Tom Aspinall, and possibly the future face of the sport, Ilia Topuria, all made their debut fight with the UFC during COVID. Just to show you with hindsight how stacked some of these events were, UFC Fight Night Morales vs. Sandhagen on October 11th on Fight Island is my favorite example. The card includes Corey Sandhagen, Edson Barbosa, Joaquin Buckley, Giga Chikadze, Aspinall's second fight, along with both DDP and Ilia making their UFC debuts. If you want to show a new fan in 2025 what was 2020 UFC like, show them this card. So to recap, I would put the three main reasons for why the UFC and COVID was the best thing to ever happen be the viewership, the moments, and the newcomers. Let me know what you guys think. Do you agree on the significance it was for the UFC to push through COVID and make fights keep happening? What do you think I missed, or what are other reasons you would give for why it was such a great, significant period of time? What was your favorite moment of the UFC in 2020? Personally, my favorite was the brief chatter and belief from fans that Fight Island would take place outside, given the propped up octagon on the beaches in the UAE. But from that, thanks for watching. I'm Casual Chris. I'll see you later.